The implementation details of authentication in a microservice-based architecture are a little different compared to a monolithic architecture. In this video, we're going to explore authentication, we're going to explore registration and logging in, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to use the BCrypt library, and that's going to allow us to hash passwords so we can secure them in the database, and then we can check them. When we log in, we can compare the hash, and then when we log in, we can create a JSON web token. The JSON web token is a way how we can secure our application. We can authenticate our application, and we can use guards to protect our routes. So the way it works in a microservices architecture is we have a shared library, and the shared library, it's going to have the Auth Guard, and the Auth Guard, it calls the authorization service to do the body of the work, generating JSON web tokens, verifying JSON web tokens, and ensuring that they're all well and good. And if they are, then that service that's used in the that JSON web token, that guard that's used in the particular route, that will be secure. So in this video, we're going to see how we can explore using Auth Guards and from a shared service. And the idea is we have it on the API endpoints, because from the API gateway. So if we put the guards on the API gateway endpoints, we can secure our application like that. But also, if we were to create a hybrid microservice that wasn't in the API gateway, for example, with the chat feature that's coming up, we're going to have our own service which connects from the client to the chat microservice, but it's going to be able to have a WebSocket connection. So it's going to have HTTP, it's going to have a port, and we want to be able to use a shared guard to be able to protect those routes as well. So there are a few extra steps in setting up authentication in microservice-based architecture. And in this video, we're going to explore exactly how to do that. So check it out. So just before we get into authentication in this video, at the end of the previous video, we were trying to import the shared module for our dynamic module registration, and we're just having some difficulty exporting that. And thankfully, one of my subscribers have helped me out, helped identify what the problem was. So we can just make a small adjustment here. Essentially, we can just have a variable here, and we can just call it providers. And this is going to be equal to the providers here. So I can just go ahead and I can cut that out, and I can paste that in here. And that way we can return the shared module, the providers, and then we can also use the exports keyword so we can export those providers. That was the missing step, or the missing line. So that means we can come into our app module, and previously where we had all of this stuff here, where we're providing the auth service and the presence service, we'll be able to lean out all of that code there. So we can do that in the providers here. Actually, we can do that in the import here. We already have it commented out. So we'll just need to have the app service here. So we can just go ahead and we can delete this now. And we can save that. And we can just go ahead and comment these in here. And then we can just go ahead and we can save that. And then we can get rid of some of these extra imports here. And in this video, we're going to be working on authentication. Now, we showed how to do migrations in the previous video. And we've already created an entity which just had a name and some other property on it, but we want to change that. So one of the commands you can run is you can actually run docker prune Docker volume pruned. And because we're just in development mode, it's perfectly fine just to remove that. But make sure that you don't have any other volumes, because I'll delete all of them. You may want to just select this particular volume and delete it. Another thing I've done here is I've just deleted the dist folder, and I'm going to delete this data folder from the DB because that's how our bind mount was working. And this will just remove some of that data there. So basically what we want to work on in this video is we want to work on registration, and we're going to use BCrypt to hash our passwords. And we also want to work on logging in, and we're going to use JSON Web Tokens for that. Now you may be familiar with these topics before, or you may not be, and that's okay too. But things are structured a little differently in the microservices architecture. The way we're using guards and all of that stuff. So make sure you watch the previous video on how to get this structure going. And without further ado, let's get into the authentication stuff. So we can just go ahead and close that stuff up there. And we can just start by opening up the terminal. We're going to need a few libraries. So we can just do an npm install. And we're going to use Passport. Passport is how we're going to manage our JSON Web Tokens. And there's also an authentication and logins. So there's also a Passport-JWT library that we'll need with that. And then we'll need Nestjs's wrapper over the top of that because it implements the Passport library in the Nestjs style. And likewise, we will need the Nestjs JWT package. And also we're going to need BCrypt, and that's what we're going to use to hash our passwords. So we're in the root of our folder here. We can just go ahead and import and install those there. And we'll just wait for that to load. So in addition to those, we're also going to want to install some of the TypeScript types so we get good IntelliSense. And we can npm install as a dev dependencies the passport-jwt type, and also the types for BCrypt. And that's just going to give us a little bit of extra type safety that we're after. So we'll just wait for that to load. Okay. So another thing we can do in our source folder, we've got this Auth Guard, Postgres DB module, shared module, and we're going to extend on this. But we can also just export these as well to make the imports a little cleaner. So we can just come here and export. For example, we can export the shared module, the shared service, the Auth Guard, and then I can just press Option Shift down to duplicate that line, and then we can also get some other things from here. So we might also want to get our Postgres module. So let's just go ahead and we can save that. Now, if we open up our Auth Guard, it's pretty blank at the moment, and we can collapse our terminal now too. But if I just did a Control C or Command C and just search for that, we can see that we're importing that from at shared Auth Guard. Now we can just go ahead and import that from the same shared package there. So we can just go ahead and we can save that. So that's all well and good. And just go ahead and we can slightly rearrange these so the Nestjs imports are up the top. So let's get that going. Then third-party stuff. We've got our library, which is sort of like a third-party, so I'm going to put it separate to the actual imports of our what are in this particular service. So that's the Auth Guard, and there's also the Postgres module. So let's just close this for a second. And if we just do a quick search for the Postgres DB module, in a similar fashion, we can just go ahead and import that from the app shared folder. So we can just go ahead and delete this here. And actually we've already got that coming in, so we can just go ahead and copy this in and delete this import here. So we can save that. And in a similar fashion, let's go ahead and just organize these while we're in this area. So we can put this user entity here, which we'll adjust shortly. And we'll put these imports here. So that way we've got the Nestjs stuff, our library, and then our service specific stuff. So one thing we want to do is we just want to, before we get going, is let's just close a few things up here. In the root folder, we have our environment variables. Now we're going to be using JSON Web Tokens. So at the very bottom here, I'm going to have a variable here, which is going to be called JWT secret. And I'm just going to set this to secret. Now you want to make that more secure in a real application, of course. But this is just for demonstration purposes. So we can go ahead and we can close that up. And if we take a look at our app controller, this is where our app API gateway is. So right now we're injecting the auth service, the presence service. We're doing some basic operations here. Now, keep in mind that we've cleared the volume, so we're going to need to recreate something for that. But what we want to do is we want to have the ability to register. So I'm just going to write a method here. So this is going to, and I'll just see if I got one. So I already got a post, so I'm just going to copy the shape of that. And I'm just going to paste that down. So I'm going to hit the auth service and the auth endpoint. I'm just going to have a /register there. So this method here is going to be called register. And it's going to want to call the auth service, which is going to go to our microservice. And we can have the command here to identify it in the microservice as simply register. Now we will want to have some variables in here, and just to start off with, we'll just get them from the body. So we will want to create an object for this, but just for the time being, let's just say we have the first name, which is just the first name, and that's just going to be a string. So I'm just going to go ahead and import our body here. And actually this comes from, oh, it's already imported. So basically we want to also have a few other things here. So let's just save this. It's just erroring because it's unused. So let's just go ahead and just duplicate this down 3 more times. So then we can just go ahead and we can change this to a last name. And we can change this to email. And we can change this to password, because when they sign up to register, they're going to have to put in their first name, last name, email, and password. And let's just go ahead, we haven't done this just yet, but usually when you're making these sorts of send requests, you put in some data. So let's just go ahead and put in the first name, last name, email, and password. And using ES6 syntax, this will auto map the variable key to the value, which happens to have the same name here. So that's the API gateway. We're going to make a HTTP request to the API gateway to try and register. And this is going to offload this to the auth controller. So let's just open up the auth controller so we can receive this request. So we can just go ahead and just copy this down in a similar way to how we have this message pattern here. We can just copy this down here. And we can have the command register, which we've set up in the API gateway. And we can just call this register as well. Now it's going to take the context, like all the other requests, to get the RabbitMQ context such that we can acknowledge the message has been received, so it can be popped off the queue. But in addition to that, we also want to have the payload. So if we just use the annotation payload, and this is coming from Nestjs Microservices, we can go ahead and we can say we want to get the new user. And we may as well create the particular object type. We'll just do it here in this particular auth section because we're going to come back to refactoring things in the next video to make everything a lot cleaner and using certain patterns and stuff like that. But if I just come to, and we're going to organize this a little better and separate auth from users and all that sort of stuff. But just for the time being, I'm just going to have a DTOs folder here. And I'm going to have a new user, newuser.dto.typescript. And this is just going to be exactly the shape there that we just had. So I'm just going to export the new user DTO. And that's the data transfer object. So that means rather than writing all the variables, we can just go ahead and send it in one object, but we're going to come back to refactoring that from the API gateway perspective in the next video. I just want to focus more on the actual functionality before we go crazy refactoring. So we have some basic functionality to be able to register and sign in and all that stuff. So in this here, we can just go ahead and we can just delete this annotation at the start here. Essentially everything's a string, first name, last name, email, password, and this should actually, if I just do a command D, it can be a semicolon, and then I can save that. So this is nothing more than just the interface. So we can just copy that. And that means we can just say we can have the type here of the new user DTO. We may need to import that though. So let's go ahead and do that. Where is add import? Okay. Let's go ahead and just save that. Once again, it just isn't happy with it not being used. So let's go ahead and just use that. So the way we can use that is in our auth controller. We can pass to the auth service, and we can just go ahead and we can have a register method. So let's go ahead and get that. And then we'll just go ahead and we'll just pass in the new user. And we can just go ahead and save that. So let's close that up. And it's just complaining that we don't have that method. So let's go ahead and create that. So if we open up our auth service. Oh, and one thing we should probably do before we do this is just amend the entity. So we're going to have the ID, And we're also going to have a first name in conjunction with the last name. So let's go ahead and get another one of those. So first name. We also want to have an email. So let's go ahead and get that in as well. So that's also going to be a string. But we want this to be unique. So there should only be one of these in the table, in the user table. So with type orm, we can actually specify some objects. So there's this unique property, which we can set to true. And that will just ensure that when we send the DTO over or entity over, that property will be unique. And similarly, we're going to have a password. We're going to be using passport to store and manage that. But there's also, we don't, by default, when you retrieve stuff using the repository, it's going to get all of them. So we don't want the password to be there. We can override this if we do need the password, and we'll see that later on. But we can just go ahead and set this to select equals false. So that will get ignored. So that's all we really need from the user entity, all the tweaks we need to make. And remember, we deleted the volumes and or deleted the database because in development mode, we're not going to be doing migrations, but we did see that in a previous video. So make sure you watch that if you prefer to do it like that. Now this auth service here, we don't really need this post user method anymore. So let's just go ahead and find that in the controller. So let's just go ahead and post user, we don't really need this method at all anymore. So we can just go ahead and we can delete that. So that means we can just delete it from here. Now get users, I think this will be a convenient function for us to just be able to see easily from making an API call to see our users, although we might not actually want to have this endpoint when it comes to the final product, but we'll just have it there for now. So what we want to do is we want to have a method to register. So let's just copy this down just so we get the shape of the function. So we want to have a method called register. And as we've seen, it takes the new user, which is of this type here. Now, just to make sure that we don't accidentally change it, or, you know, play around with the actual object itself, we can actually just have a read-only type here from TypeScript, and that will allow us to view the object and get the properties from it, but it won't allow us to mutate it, which has an extra layer of safety there. So we can just go ahead and import this here. And let's just, once again, just organize these imports a little nicer. So we can move it like that. And then we can get this third-party library of type orm here. And we can just go ahead and put these two together. So if you're wondering what these blue squiggly lines are, I got C spell, it's an extension on. Usually it's it does point out things like this that aren't actual errors, but sometimes it points out if you spell variables wrong. For example, if I had register like that, you just get that blue line. So that's handy. It actually helps catch a couple of bugs sometimes if you don't get the full TypeScript support you need. So the register method, basically, it's going to register. And when we register, what we want to give back is a promise because we're using async. We will see an example of observable later on. And my LinkedIn clone series is completely written with observables. But I find that async is a lot easier to use for most cases. But I will show you how to use promises if you're not familiar with those already. So basically we want to return a user entity, which is what we've just written in the entity file, first name, last name, email, and not password. So basically we don't want to do this. We just want to get the information, so we can use object destructuring for this. So from the new user, we can go ahead and we can just get all of those properties. So first name, last name, email, password. And what we want to do, basically what we want to do first is we want to see if there is an existing user, because if someone enters an email address to register, but that email is already taken, perhaps by the person themselves or someone else, we want to check our database to see if that user exists. And if it does exist, we just want to not allow the user to register and just give back a, an error message or an exception. So basically we want to have a find by email, because we saw that email was a unique value, and that's something that they are entering in to an input field. So I might just have here another method here. And again, I'm going to separate the user and auth stuff in another video. So just for now, we'll just have this here. So we'll call this find by email. And this is just going to take an email, which will just be a string here. And based on that string, we're going to get back a user entity. Now this time we do want to get the password, so we're going to see how we can override the select false. But basically we want to call the user repository, and we can call the find one method, because there should only be one, where, and this pretty much reads similar to SQL, where, but more in object notation, where the email is equal to the email. And another property here that we can use is select. So select, as the name implies, allows us to select the properties that we want, and they'll override what we've specified on the entity. So we pretty much want everything here. So we can just go ahead and write out all the variables that we want. And the key extra variable is obviously going to be the password, because we need to use the password to be able to log in, and we need to hash the password as well. So we can go ahead and find that. So now we can use this method. I can say, well, I want to get the existing user if one exists, and we can just simply await this find by email. And all I need to do is type in the email here. So basically, if there is an existing user, what we want to do is, well, there's actually like a conflict exception, because that information that the user is trying to send is in conflict with the register method, because we can't register something with a unique email if we type in a email which already exists. So we can just go ahead and import this conflict exception, and we can also have a custom message here if you want. So I'm just going to say an account with that email already exists, So I'm just going to save that, and now exit the function there and give that feedback back to the client or whoever called the API call. So next, what we want to do is, if they get past that, that means the information's valid. What we want to do is we want to hash the password. So hashing the password means it's sort of like encrypting it, but you can't decrypt it. So it messes all of the, it sort of muddles up and uses specific hashing algorithms to make a unreadable and very complex and impossible to guess, basically, hash password. And our server, so let's just actually write a little helper function for this to see what is going on here. So let's have a little hash password function here. So this is just going to take the password, which is a string, and it's going to give back the hash password. So this takes a little bit of time to do. So it's going to be an async function here, and it's going to give back our hash password, which is a string. And we can actually import this from BCrypt. So just here, I'm going to import everything from BCrypt as BCrypt. And this is coming from BCrypt, because BCrypt, it gives us a bunch of methods. So if we come to our hash password function here, we can actually use BCrypt. So we can just simply return bcrypt.hash. So this is the hashing function. And if you take a look here, it takes the data that we're going to put in, which is going to be our password, and it also has salts or rounds. And the salt is to be used in encryption. If it's specified as a number, then a salt will be generated with a specific number of rounds used. Now, basically, all that means is it basically changes our password that many times. And you don't want to have too many times, because it's not really necessarily past a certain point, and that obviously is more compute power. If you look online for different resources, a common accepted number is 12. That's strong and performant. So basically, just to illustrate this, if you type in like a password, let's say your password is password, and then the first round, it'll change it to something like that. Then the second round, it'll take this value and it'll change it to something completely different again, and then it'll do that 12 times. Now, there's no way to unencrypt this. The way the hashing works is the server, so this Node API, when it's running, it's going to be configured in a certain way such that when you hash something, when you call the hashing algorithm again for the same sequence of strings, you'll get the same hash. So you actually want to use the server's API, in memory of the password, of the hash password, because that's the same algorithm that gets used when we store it in the database. So then we can simply call that same function and compare it to the database, because we don't want to obviously store the password in plain sight in the database, because if our database was compromised, people have access to all those private information. And you can actually hash not just the password, but other details. If you really want to make things super secure, you could hash the phone numbers and emails and all those other sorts of things. But once you see it for one password, it's pretty much the same thing for all of them. So basically, we can come back to our register function here. and we can get the hash password. And we just need to await for this hash password function here. And we're just passing in the actual password that we're getting. This is what we're getting from the user input form from the client. So, and that's going to our API gateway, which accepts HTTP requests using HTTPS, so they will be encrypted. So there shouldn't be any man-in-the-middle attacks because that data will be encrypted, and then when it reaches our server, then we hash it. So we can store it in the database securely. So we can go ahead and we can just get the saved user, and we're going to just await the user repository because it has the save method on it. And this is where we can just have the first name, last name, email, and importantly, we want the password, and we don't want to make the mistake of using, this new AS6 syntax for the password. We need to explicitly make sure that we type in the hash password here, because this is what's getting saved to the database, and we need what's saved to the database to be the hash password, not the password that they entered in. So since we put the password in when we're getting the existing user, we just want to make sure we don't return that. So just before we give back the data, let's just make sure that we delete the save, the password. So we can just use the delete notation to delete a property from an object. And then we can just go ahead and we can return the saved user. So let's just take a recap of what we've done here. In our API gateway, we've exposed the HTTP endpoint for the auth/register endpoint, and it's expecting the first name, last name, email, and password. This will call our microservice, our auth service, and it's going to look for that register message pattern command. Now it's got the payload associated with it, which we've created into an object here. When the auth service has received the message, we go ahead and we acknowledge it, and we can thus call the register method. And the register method, it essentially takes the information, the first name, email, password, last name. It uses that to find any existing user if there is one. If there is, it will give back a conflict exception. But otherwise, if all the details are well and good, we can go ahead and hash the password and save that into the database. And then just simply remove the password. So when they make the API call, they don't get the password in their API response. So let's just go ahead and test that. So let's just run a Docker compose up. And I'm just going to -- build here, just because we've made a bunch of changes. So let's go ahead and just wait that to load. This might take a little extra to load because I cleared the volumes and also deleted a few things. Let's just wait for this to load here. And we can start to create our Postman request here. So we're going to want to duplicate this tab here. And this is going to be the register tab. And in the body here, we can just go to raw JSON. Let's see, do we have any? Okay, so we're going to have to type this out. So Jason going to need to put the key into a string. So let's say the first name is John. Last name is Pepink. The email is john@gmail.com. And let's say the user enters the password. Let's just keep it simple. And we'll set that to password. So let's just check that one of our other methods is working. So again, this presence one, hello world, we're going to use an Auth Guard on this and make it so we need the JWT to be able to access that. But just before we do that, let's just call this endpoint. This should get the list of the users. Looks like something's gone wrong though. So let's just open up the Visual Studio Code here. Let's open up our Docker containers here. So auth service, BCrypt. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure that we've actually installed this. I thought we did. So let's just cancel this request. And actually, I'll just pause the video for a second. So basically, I just run an npm uninstall BCrypt and npm install BCrypt. I'm not sure what the problem was, but that seemed to solve it. And I've just rerun this request here with these details here. And we can see that rather than getting the password back, we've excluded that, but we do get the ID here. So if we go to get all our users, we can see that it also excludes the password, and we get that user there. And then just to confirm that works, let me just do a John2 email here. And then I go to get that. And then that's all well and good. So we've got the registration working. Now we want to have logging in. And logging in is a little bit more tricky because it requires using the JWT guard, the Auth Guard from the shared library, and just a little bit of extra work getting it working in a microservices architecture. So let me just go ahead and just exit out of this. So I'm going to make quite a few changes here. And I don't want Docker to get into a weird state. So I'm just going to run docker compose down just to shut down those containers. And then I'm just going to collapse the terminal so we get more screen real estate here. So, okay, let's work on the login method. And for that, let's go to our app controller to start off with. And let's just copy this down. So let's just do that and uncollapse it. So let's hit the auth login endpoint to call the login method here. Now, they don't need to put their first name or last name here, so we can remove those. We can just have the email and the password. And we can go ahead and call the login endpoint. And similarly, we can remove that. So this is going to log in with the email and password. So if we come to the auth controller, we can go ahead and let's just close this up. If we come to the auth controller, we can go ahead and we can copy this down. and this is for the login match. So basically, when they hit that, it's going to call this auth controller here. We're going to want a payload again, but rather than new user, we want to have the existing user. So in our DTOs, let's just create a new file here called existing user. So we can just export the class existing user DTO, which is just going to be the email and the password. And again, right now we're just doing this in auth. In the next video, we're going to come back and refactor things. But this video is already going to be quite long enough. So let's just focus on getting the functionality working. So let's just copy this name of this class here. So basically, rather than new user, we're going to have existing user, and then we're going to have that of the type of existing user DTO. Did that auto import? I'm not sure. It did not. So let's go ahead and bring that in. So we can, once again, we can acknowledge that we've received the message from this service. And we can just say, we can call the, instead of calling register, we can go ahead and we can call the login method. So we need to create that, of course. So let's just go ahead and put this on here and just save that. Now we need to create a login method here. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's just copy this here. Actually, let's copy this here. Control C, paste that in, and we can change this to login. And in the same way, we've got this here. We can go ahead and change this here. And this can be the existing user. So we'll change this to existing user. So we're going to need to import that. So what we can do is, let's just go ahead and delete this here. And actually what we want to return is not a promise user entity. Actually, let's just let TypeScript infer this. It's just going to be simply the token. So the first thing I want to do is just get the email and password. So let's just get that by destructuring. And this is going to be from the existing user. The existing user, they're going to type in a form. They're going to type in their email and their password in the input fields. We're going to get those. Then what we can do is we can say, okay, we can get the user. Now we should validate the user based on the email and password. And we can do that by finding them by the email once again, checking that the user exists, and then checking that the passwords match. So we can do all of that. So firstly, let's write a function to check that the passwords match. So we can have a does password match function. So this will just return a Boolean basically. So we can pass in the password that they've entered, And then we can also check the hash password from the BCrypt library that we've imported before. And BCrypt, it uses the same algorithm, so it can detect the same strings get mapped into the same thing. So basically, just to be clear on this, this is going to return a Boolean, but it's going to use the BCrypt library to compare that, and that takes a little bit of time to do. So we're going to return it in a promise. So we can just use the BCrypt library to compare the password and the hashed password, and we can just return that, and that's going to return either true or false depending on if the passwords are the same or not. So with that, we can go ahead and we can create the validate user function, because we can only log in if we validate the user credentials, and we can only validate the user credentials if the passwords match. So we can go ahead and we'll still need the password, and we'll also need the email, which is just a string. So they're going to enter the email and the password. We don't need this here. And this is going to give back the user entity. So what we can do, before we actually created this find by email function, and this is going to be reused here. So let's go ahead and do that. And it gets the password as well. And we're going to need that password because we're going to need to compare the password with the hash password. So we can just go ahead and we can just say, okay, we can await this find by email, and then we can pass in the email here, which is just a string, and then we can determine whether or not the user exists. So basically we can have a variable and we can say, does the user exist? And we can just use the double bang operator because basically if it tries to find the email and it exists, well, then it'll be come back with something. Otherwise, it will come back null, in which case the user does not exist. So if the user, if that does not exist, we can just simply return null here and handle that in the other function. So basically, we can have a variable here. So does the password match? So we can just await the does password match function that we just created. And then we can pass in the password that the user's typed in the input field, and we can compare that to the hash password. So the find by email field, it selects the password from the database. So we can just simply say user.password, so that's the hash password. So we're comparing the string to the hash password, and then using BCrypt, we're able to compare that if that password the user's entered is equal to the password that's saved, and if so, they will be able to log in. So that means, well, firstly, we should have a little check here. We can say if the user doesn't match the password, if the password doesn't match, basically we can just return null here. Otherwise, we can return the user. So this user has the password on it, but this is a helper function. You could remove it here if you wanted to, but we're going to return something different because we're actually going to use it in the login method here. So if we return to our login method, we can get that user by awaiting for this .validate user, which is there, and just passing in the email and password. And again, we can just have a simple check, say if there's no user, what we can do, we can just throw an error. We can just say, okay, well, you're not authorized to log in. We can throw an unauthorized exception here. So let's just throw that. So if there is a user and they are valid, that means they're okay to log in. So what we can do at this stage is we can create a JSON web token. So we can just go ahead and create a JSON web token, and we can just await. Now we need to get the JWT service in here. So if we come back up to the top here to the constructor, we can go ahead and we can inject that. So we're already injecting the user repository. The next thing we want to inject is the JWT service. So this is going to be read only. We'll call it JWT service, which is going to be of the type JWT service, coming from Nestjs JWT. So we can just save that, and we can return to our login method at the bottom here. And now we can use that JWT service, and that JWT service, it has a function on it called sign async. So what sign async does is it takes the object and it creates a token, a JSON web token from that object, and then that's stored in memory. And then further requests can validate that their token is the same as the token that's been signed, and they'll allow us to get past any guards. So that's the JSON web token that creates the JSON web token. Basically that creates everything, but all we really need back to the client is the token itself. So this is why we can just infer this by sending back the JSON web token just like this here. Okay. So we've created the login method, but the whole point of being able to log in is to have protected routes. So it's the endpoints, they need to have auth guards, and basically based on the JSON web token that's given back to the client, which is then attached to the future request, that will determine whether or not they have the authorization to make the request. So we could make the auth guard. Now we've made the very beginnings of the auth guard. But one thing we might need to do before we can even do that is we might need to return to our auth controller, because we need to have the ability to verify the JSON web token. So actually we're going to need to create some JSON web token guards for this. So let's just take a look at our auth folder so far. We can see that we don't have any of the JSON web token stuff. And in the shared folder that we created in libs, in source, we created this auth guard, but it's not really an auth guard. It's just acting as an auth guard with this simple method here. So we want to turn this into a real auth guard. Now, the way it works in microservices is we need the auth guard in here because we need to use it not just in the auth module, but in all these other modules. And we need to, like, the bulk of the work's actually done from the auth service. It's just the auth guard is in this shared folder here. So we need to set up the auth, all of the auth related stuff in the auth service. So let's go and just open this up here. So we'll come back to this Auth Guard here. Let's just open up the auth controller. So we're going to need a few things. We're going to need a JWT guard, a JWT strategy, a JWT interface. So let's just start by creating a JWT strategy. And for now, let's just put everything in the root of this auth folder. We'll come back to refactoring this and cleaning everything up. But just to get the functionality right, let's just create this Auth Guard here. So we can create a JWT guard. And this is quite simple. Basically what this does, and let's just copy this here from the auth service here. All we want to do is we just want to have a service here. So we have the injectable keyword here, which comes from Nestjs common. And then we're going to just call this JWT guard. And this is just going to extend the Auth Guard, which is JWT, that there. So this Auth Guard here is coming from Nestjs passport. And that's all we need here, that JWT guard there. We also need to have the strategy. So we can just say JWT dash strategy .ts here. So I'm just going to copy this in again because it's going to be a similar sort of thing here. And now we can close this file here. But we don't need the Auth Guard here, so we don't need to extend that. But we will need to extend passport strategy. So, and actually we'll call this the JWT strategy because this JWT strategy extends the passport strategy, and that takes the particular strategy, which is coming from passport JWT. So this all comes together in the module. So we'll need to import that in just a second. But basically what we've got here is we have a service, which is the particular implementation strategy, and all the work sort of done for us in the passport strategy. Now, we need to make a request as well. So let's create, basically, the way we're going to access the JSON Web Token is going to be from the request. So we're going to put it on the request. So we can actually have our own request interface here. So I'm just going to call this JWT request dot interface here dot .ts. And then I can just go ahead and I can import request from Express, because it actually builds up on Express, the Express request. So that means I can export an interface here. And I'm just going to call this JWT request, because it's just the normal request. So it extends that request, the Express request. But it may have a JSON Web Token on it. It may not have a JSON Web Token on it. But it might have the JSON Web Token on it if we've attached it. So that becomes important because we're going to need a way to move the JSON Web Token through our microservices and through our request. So this is, one way to do that. So that means we can come back to our JWT strategy. Now we're going to want to, if we look at passport strategy, it actually requires us to do some stuff in the constructor. So that means, because we're extending that means we need to have a constructor. Our constructor doesn't need anything, but inside of the constructor, we need to call the constructor from the passport strategy. So we can just call the super keyword from, to access that constructor. And it expects some dependency injection. Basically, what it's expecting is it wants the JWT from the request. So we can say we can get the JSON web token from request, and we can just extract the JWT, and that comes from passport JWT. And then there's this method called from extractors. And basically what this does is, we can pass in multiple ones, but we can pass in this callback here. So it's going to take the request, which is going to be the JWT request that we've just created. And then it's going to return, if we have it, the request .jwt here. So let's just save that to reformat things. So that's the first thing it needs. It also needs the secret or key. So secret or key. And we've created that environment variable, so we can just access that by accessing process.env .jwt underscore secret. One more thing we want, because it doesn't happen by default, is we want to not ignore, like if a token's expired, we don't want to allow it. So we can have this ignore expiration and set that to false. I'm not sure if they've changed that to the default, but just to be sure, you would expect it to be the default. But I remember in the past, for some reason, it wasn't. So I'm explicitly having that property in here. There's also this validate function. So with this extending this passport strategy, it also sort of expects this validate function. It doesn't really, the idea here is that you take your request. So we got this payload, and that can be basically any sort of type. So we can actually, this is one of the instances where you can just use the any keyword. And basically what I'm going to do is just simply return the payload, because we're going to actually handle this elsewhere. But the idea here is that, you get the payload, and the payload should have the user ID or email. And then you can go ahead and you can check that that matches it from the database. And then that's all well and good. But as we've seen, and we will see, we're going to do this elsewhere. You could do it here as well, but there's no real need for, because the way we're doing it sort of supersedes this. But I'm just having it here just because it's sort of expected part of this here. So that's the JWT strategy. So we've created the JWT strategy, we've got the request, we've got the guard. I think a lot of the work goes into the actual Auth Guard. So now the idea, and just before I forget, we need to open up our Auth module and just declare a few things here. So, well, firstly, the way all this stuff works, like how does the Auth Guard, how is it aware of the strategy and all of that sort of stuff. The way it works is basically we can import that, and we can import the JWT module. So let's go ahead and import the JWT module, and we can call this register async method. And this is going to take some imports here. So we're going to have some imports, and the imports that we're going to have is the config module. And that will allow us to use the config service in our use factory. So we can go ahead and use the config service of the type config service. So let's just get that. And then we can go ahead and basically we just want to return the object. So we need the secret, and we can actually use the config service, the get method here. That will help us get the JWT secret here. And then we also need some sign options here. These are optional. So basically your JSON Web Token, it's going to last a certain period of time. If you want to have control over when your token expires, you can just use this expires in property here. So I'm going to set it to an hour, which is 3600 seconds. And then just to use that config service, we need to inject that. So let's just go ahead and bring in this config service here. And let's just go ahead and save that. Now we'll just need this comma here. And also here. So let's just save that. So now we've got our JSON Web Token module, and it has the configuration for, getting the secret, the expiration of the token. We need to also provide here, it's expecting us to bundle everything together. So we can have the JWT guard that we've created and the JWT strategy, which is here. So we've saved that. So, okay, so that's the auth module sorted. Now we can come to our Auth Guard. This is the shared Auth Guard. And basically what we want to do is in our, we want to protect one of our routes. So the route we want to protect is coming from the app, from the API gateway, from the app controller. Basically, we want to protect this presence route. And we want to use the Auth Guard, which comes from the shared controller, the shared library. And then the shared library will access, the functionality from the auth service, including its own JWT guard. And then if all is well and good, we want to allow that request to go through. Otherwise, we want to block that request from happening. So basically, we want to have our guard on the everything on the API gateway, so it doesn't go into the other services. But we also want it to be flexible enough so if we create, another service, like a hybrid microservice that isn't in the API gateway, that connects directly from the client to that, we also want to use the Auth Guard from there, which it can still access the auth functionality, but the guard's provided through it by the shared library. So with that said, we can go to our Auth Guard here. Now, what we can do is we can go ahead and run, we can create we're creating our own Auth Guard here. So we can implement the can activate. This is coming from Nestjs common. So we need to implement that interface. Firstly, we can just delete this has JWT. We no longer need this. Let's just check that we haven't used it anywhere though. I think we may have used it somewhere. Okay, so we can just go ahead and we can just delete it. This was just a temporary thing. And yeah, so basically we don't want to do this here. And we don't want to do this here. That was just for setting it up in the previous video. But we will want to import this. And if we just come back here, we can just now go ahead and just delete this here. So let's set this up. So we can see that basically what the can activate thing does is it takes the, the context, and it returns a Boolean, either a Boolean, a promise Boolean, or an observable Boolean. So I think this is where we're going to demonstrate some observables if you haven't seen already. It's going to be quite straightforward though. If you want to go much deeper into Nestjs and observables, I'd suggest checking out the LinkedIn clone series. But basically what we want to do is essentially, well, we want to inject, we need to call the functionality from the auth service. So the auth service, we want to be able to verify the JSON Web Token based on some stuff in here. So perhaps we should actually go back to the auth service. Basically in the auth service, now that we have the JSON Web Token, we're assuming that it's going to be attached. So we actually, the auth controller, let's just copy this down here. So we're going to want to target the verify JSON Web Token here. And basically we will want to put a guard here. And the guard we want to put here is the JWT guard that's coming from the auth section. So we just implemented those details in the JWT strategy. So just to quickly, this JWT guard, it's using this Auth Guard here, which has come from Nestjs passport, and the passport is connected to this JWT strategy. This is the particular strategy that gets used. And we're expecting the JWT to be on the request headers. Well, just on the request.jwt, because that's just how we've set it up. So because we're expecting that from the request, we can go ahead and we can just use these guards here. And then it's essentially going to verify that. So yeah, so we don't need to put this in the API gateway, which is what I was just thinking about, because we're going to call it from the auth service. Sorry, from the shared service, which will need the auth service injected into it. So let's just go ahead and just call this verify JWT. So it's going to take the context and the payload that it's expecting. Let's just call this payload. It's just going to be of the type the JWT and the string, and this will be attached when we call this here. So that's where this will come from. So once again, we can just acknowledge that. And then we can just go ahead and we can have a function here, and we'll call this verify JWT for verifying the JSON Web Token, which will take the payload and it will take the JSON Web Token. Now, of course, we need to create that. So just down here, below this login method here, let's just copy that down, and we can go ahead and we can call this verify JWT, which is going to take the JWT, which at this stage will just be the string. Now, what I want to return, well, let's just go through the code and then I'll come back to the return type here. Basically, if there's no JSON Web Token with the request, we can just go ahead and we can just throw a new unauthorized exception here. Otherwise, what we want to do is we can have a try catch here. Basically, what we want to try to do is we want to await this JWT service, because the JWT service, it has a verify async method, and we can just pass in the JSON Web Token. So you're getting a JSON Web Token from the client. We're going to verify that with our JWT verify async method here, and that gives back the payload, so whatever the request is, but also, oh sorry, yeah, that's right, whatever the request is, but also some JSON Web Token specific stuff. So we can, and one of those things is an expiration date, and that's coming from EXP. And actually, we want to return that. So we can just return that EXP here. So we want to know what the expiration date is, so we can check that our token hasn't reached the expiration date to make sure that it's valid. And hence why we don't need to do the check in the validate method. Because we're doing it like this. And then if there is an error, we can just throw that error. So we can just go ahead and copy that in here. So basically, we can see that it actually infers the type here. So it's going to give back this here, but it's inferring that as any. So let's actually be a little bit more specific. Basically, after this is done, well, it's going to be asynchronous. So we can have this promise, and in the generic type here, we can have the expiration date, but we can cast that to a number here. Just because we know what that's going to be. So basically what we've done here is we've just built out the verify JSON Web Token function. So this is going to be called from our Auth Guard each time a request is made. So we can check that we can check that JSON Web Token is valid, and they can actually have the credentials and authorization to be able to access the required resources. So we can close these up now, and we can return back to our Auth Guard. So if we look at our Auth Guard, basically the way that well, firstly we need to delete this here because it hasn't been implemented yet. The way that we're using our Auth Guard is we're putting it on the API gateway, and that's HTTP requests. And if we also want to put it on a hybrid microservice, that's also going to be able to receive HTTP requests. For any microservices, like if we get an API request that hits an API gateway and then goes to a microservice and then goes to another microservice and then is protected, we don't need to make all of those calls. We can just simply protect it from the beginning. So basically what we want to do here is we can set the context and we can get the type. And basically if it's not HTTP, because it can be a remote procedure call, which is the other thing it can be if you're going from microservice to microservice. We want to return false, which means that it will fail and it won't make it past the guard. So if you did want to, for whatever reason, you wanted to go from the microservice to microservice, basically the way it works in HTTP is you just go ahead and just get the header, and you get this from the context. And there's a switch to HTTP method, but there's also a switch to RPC method, and you can do a similar thing from that. So it's pretty straightforward. So just to illustrate, if we make the switch to HTTP from the context, from the execution context, we can go ahead and we can get the request, and the request is going to have the headers, and we're looking for the authorization header. So whenever we make the HTTP request, we want to look at the authorization header because we're going to put a bearer token in the header. Well, that's what we're expecting for our API protected resources. So I can just go ahead, and I know that this is going to be a string, so I can just go ahead and cast it like that. So let's just go ahead and just save this here. So yeah, and if you wanted to get it from the remote procedure call, you just do switch to RPC, and I think there's I think it's not get request, but I think there's another method that you can use. So context, switch to RPC, get context and get data. So, you know, as long as you've set those in the same way that you've set the HTTP, you should be able to get that if your project needs it. But to me, it makes more sense to protect the resource from the API gateway right from the beginning. But just mentioning that in case you do need that. So basically what we want to do firstly is, well, if there's no headers, if there's no authorization header set, we can return false. I don't know what happened there. Let's just put a wait, what happened? Is there something? Control save. Oh, did I miss the? Oh, I'm outside of here. So basically, okay, that's better. Yeah, so if there's no authorization header, well, they obviously don't have the JSON Web Token in the auth header, so we fail the request. But the way that we make the request is basically what we're going to do when we make the request here is in the authorization section, we can actually use a bearer token. So a bearer token, that's where we put the JSON Web Token. But because it's a bearer token, it has the bearer prefix. So this is a convention you might see. Basically, the request, let's say you have your JSON Web Token and it looks like that. It's going to be prefixed with the word bearer like that and a space, and then the JSON Web Token, whatever it is. So basically what we can do is we can split that. So we can get the auth header and we can split it like that. And if there's nothing to split it on, there'll only be one element in the array. But that means we'll be able to get the parts, and there should only be 2 parts. So we can get the auth header parts. We can save that. And basically we can have a check here. And we can say if the auth header parts, if that has a length that is not equal to 2, or something isn't right, so we can just go ahead and return false. But otherwise we'll make it pass there. And then we don't need the first part, which is the bearer space. We just need the second part, which is just going to be the JSON Web Token itself. And that's going, we can use array destructuring to get the JSON Web Token from the auth header parts. So after all of that, you know, we should have the JSON Web Token, unless someone's made the request here with bearer space. Well, you know, some string and then a space and then something else. But that's okay because we can actually verify the JWT using the method we just created before from the auth service. So this is where we're going to use an observable. So if you've never used an observable before, it's basically like a promise, but for streams of data instead of just one-off things. Although you can use them for just one-off things. And the whole point of observables, they're a little trickier than promises, but the power of them, let's say, is in the pipeable operators. So you can actually sort of intercept the request, and you know, you can change the response, or you know, you can yeah, well, I mean, that's the main thing you do with them, is you hook into the request, and then based on the request, you can modify and adapt things. You can call other HTTP requests if you need to, get more data if you need to, and then you can return your data all in one step, sort of similar to .then, and then you do some stuff. It's just observables let you do more stuff, let's say. So I'm going to call this auth service, and basically we need to inject this, but this Auth Guard is going to be used in it's going to be used in the particular module. So we're going to use it in the presence module, which means we're going to want to register whenever we use the Auth Guard. We're also going to want to register the auth service, and we saw at the very beginning of the video a one-liner to be able to do that now that it's in the shared module. And then that way we can import the auth module. So basically we can come to the constructor, which we do not have a constructor, so we can create one. So let's create this constructor here. So we create this constructor here, and since we have a constructor, that allows us to inject. So we can inject the auth service, and this is a private read-only auth service, which is a client proxy, as we've seen. Where have we seen this? In the app controller, I believe. We've got the exact same thing here. So you can just go ahead and probably be easier to just copy that in here. Where was I? Auth Guard. So you can just copy that in so you don't get any typos. And then you'll just need to import the client proxy from the microservices folder there. So now we have access to that auth service from this Auth Guard here. We can go ahead and we can send, and then we can type in our command. So we have the verify JWT because if we open up our auth controller, auth controller here, we got this verify JWT, and then it's expecting this payload here of the JWT string. So that's how we're going to make the request. And this is how we make the request from the shared library. So with that, we can go ahead and we can just pass in the JSON Web Token. Now this actually, this should be auth service. So this whole thing here, it actually returns an observable. And as we mentioned before, you can sort of intercept the outcome of those. Because if you look at here, we see that we're verifying the JSON Web Token. We're going to send it the request and it's going to have our JSON Web Token. And then if you look at the service, it's going to verify the JSON Web Token. And that just uses the JWT service to verify that JSON Web Token. And basically, that's going to give back the expiration date. So if we come to our Auth Guard here, we can get that expiration date. And the way we get it is we can use the pipe operator. So pipe is what allows us to call any of the pipeable operators. Basically, it's sort of like a dot then, essentially. And then we can have this one pipeable operator called a switch map. So what a switch map does, it takes one observable and it gives you back another observable. So we know that we're going to get back the expiration. So we can actually sort of destructure it like this because we're going to get back, we're interested in the value which corresponds to the EXP key, which is going to be a number. So basically what we can do is we can have a arrow function here. And the difference between switch map and map is map returns like a primitive, like in this case a number or something like that. But we want, or like true or false. We want to return true or false because this is all happening in the guard. So basically, well, firstly we should check, if there is no expiration, we want to return false because something went wrong. But because we're using switch map, we need to use make false an observable. So that's just a check. We do have other checks, so probably shouldn't be able to get into that state, but just for the extra certainty. The thing is, when you get a JSON Web Token back, if I have a quick look over here, actually we haven't created it yet. So we'll see that shortly. But basically, for some reason, when JSON Web Tokens are created, it gives you back the time in seconds. But we want to compare it, and that's the time in seconds after epoch time. You may know that if you use the date.now function, you get the time after epoch time, which is after the 1st of January 1970. That's in milliseconds. So basically what we want to do is we just want to have a variable here, and I'm just going to call it token expiration milliseconds, which is we're just going to take the date, the expiration time in seconds, and to convert it to milliseconds, you times it by 1,000. So what that allows us to do is we can check if the token is valid. So we can have a variable here called isJSONWebToken valid. And essentially, if the date right now, or the number of milliseconds right now, if that is less than the token EXP milliseconds, that means that the tokens, it was valid, but it no longer is valid now. So basically we can return, and we need to return an observable because we're using switch map, is JWT valid. So if it isn't valid, it will return false, but if it is valid, it will return true. So we've got this switch map operator here. We can also have a catch error, because if anything went wrong, we don't want our server to crash. Now we will have better error handling in other videos, and I got a whole video on error handling from my LinkedIn clone series. So, you know, if you're interested in that side of things, I'd recommend you check out that video. But we can get this catch error pipeable operator here, which is just takes a callback here. And then we can just once again just throw a new, and if the token isn't valid, then they're unauthorized. So we can just return a unauthorized exception here. So just to recap, we've created the Auth Guard, which is in the common library. It makes use of the auth service. So that means when we use it in a particular service, we need to inject that and start the module, import the module corresponding, which is the auth service. And basically we're making the HTTP request from the API gateway. We explained how you could do it with RPC if you wanted to, but we're not going to do that. And then we've explained the bearer token and extracting the JSON Web Token, making sure it's valid. And then this whole guard, basically, the whole point of it is it either returns true or false, so that when we try to use the guard, if it's false, it doesn't let you access the resource, but if it's true, it will let you access the resource. So with that said, basically what we want to do is we want to go to our presence module, and let's just have a look at the app module. We can see in the app module that we've used the shared module. So we can just actually copy this here because we want to protect a resource in the presence controller. We want to protect this here. So we need to go to the presence module here. So we want the shared module because it's going to have some other functionalities that we want. But then we also want to connect to the auth service. So we can go ahead and do that. And the reason we're connecting to the auth service is because in the provider here, we want to get the Auth Guard, which makes use of that. So we need to declare it in the module. So we can just go ahead and we can just quickly save that. And then if we come to the presence controller, we don't want to put the, we basically want to, we want to go to the auth module, the app module. And we want to go to the app controller. Okay. So, all right, let's just get rid of this here for a second. Yeah, actually we don't need the Auth Guard here, sorry. we need to go to the app controller because we're doing it from the API gateway. So let's go to the API gateway here. Let's open up the app controller. So we've got the auth service here. So we got the auth service. So what we can do is we can get the Auth Guard. So basically, here, we can go ahead and we can use the guards, Auth Guard. So I'm not sure if I actually need it in the other module or not. So let's just go ahead and import that from app.shared. So I think the way this should work is we've got the Auth Guard. Like, let's say someone tries to make the API call to get the presence here. We got this Auth Guard here. So the Auth Guard is going to, and in this area, we've got the module. So I think what we should be able to do is we should be able to actually remove that from the presence module. Although I'll need to confirm this. So let's remove the Auth Guard from here. And I don't think we need this. So I'm just going to comment this out here. So let's just comment that out here. Okay, so let's just recap. We want the presence to be a protected route. So we use the Auth Guard, and this Auth Guard, it's on the API gateway, but it's coming from the shared Auth Guard here. So before it tries to do this sort of stuff here, it comes to the Auth Guard. Now the Auth Guard, it calls the auth service, and essentially on the auth service, if we open up the auth service, let's see here, auth service, we have the verified JSON Web Token. It's expecting the JSON Web Token. If it verifies all well and good, you'll get the expiration date from the auth service. So that's the works happening in the auth service. And then this shared Auth Guard, it's going to basically say, okay, well, you know, your JSON Web Token might be valid. So the app controller has the Auth Guard. The Auth Guard, it calls the verify JWT. Now verify JWT, if we look at the Auth controller, this uses the JSON Web Token Guard. Okay, so because this uses the JSON Web Token Guard, it uses the JSON Web Token strategy from the auth module, and then that extracts the JSON Web Token from the request. Okay, so everything should work. Now I know we've done a lot of coding without testing here, so hopefully we don't get too many errors. Let's just run a Docker Compose down and a Docker Compose up build, and let's start to test to see if everything is working as expected. Okay, so everything's loading up, which is a good sign. Let's open up Docker. Let's open up our presence API. Honestly, I'll be a little surprised if there isn't any errors. Okay, so here's one. Nest can't resolve dependencies of the Auth Guard. Okay, let's just check to see if there's any others. Let's open up Auth. So Nest can't resolve dependencies of Auth Guard. Okay. Okay, so we got the same thing. So let's just pause for a second. Okay, so I've just come to the shared module and I just deleted the auth here because we're no longer going to need the Auth Guard in the shared module. So make sure you just delete that there. And then you can just go ahead and delete this too. So everything's working now. So just to check everything is working, let's try make a request. Now we're trying to get the presence, but we don't have the JSON Web Token attached. So we get this 403 forbidden resource. We can come here. Let's create a new user. So let's say we create John3. We create that. Now let's try sign in as John3. And I've just made the password. And you see that we've get this JSON Web Token. So let's just go ahead and copy that. So we copy that. And now this forbidden resource, if we were to paste this in here, we can see that we now get that. So that's everything I wanted to cover. We've covered registration, logging in, BCrypt, hashing the password, JSON Web Tokens, and how to set that up in the microservice architecture. Now in the next video, we should, on the back end, we want to clean things up. We want to use some patterns, make the user repository and organize all the code and all of that sort of stuff. And we also want to come into React Native and see how that works, and create a form and register and all that sort of stuff, and have protected routes, and pretty much they'll cover all the basics you need in React Native, just with some basic React knowledge. So if you're keen for that one, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in